Hello, my name is Janice Arnold, Board Development Consultant at the Manitoba School Boards Association. Welcome to our webinar on getting your house in order. The original air date of this webinar was in January of 2013, and this version is being recorded without a live audience. Therefore, the questions asked by participants at the end of the original are unavailable at this time. All right, in a usual live webinar, I do post a number of questions, and we do a short poll that will help provide a quick picture and steer the conversation. However, we're going to go straight on to our presentation, so let's get started. I'll take a moment to bring up the webcam. There it is. Hi, everyone. Okay, just like putting your house on the market and doing some last-minute things to give it more curb appeal, why not think about that in terms of your board? What is your board's curb appeal or street value? How is it functioning? Is it viewed outside as a high-functioning board or a board that gets things done? Is it innovative and moving forward? Or are you just keeping house? Is it something that people in your community are vying to become part of? With upcoming elections, those are good time to take stock. While it's tempting to say, well, we should see what the next board wants to do and they can have it in place and they'll give some of the answers. Or perhaps you might want to say that it's not really the time to slack off. Rather, what you could be saying is, we're not done yet. It's not time to take the look back or start the review and evaluation. That will come, but what we have to do in the next few months, it's, I guess, really just time to get your house in order. So let's take a look at some things that you can do. You might want to look at your strategic plan or your priorities. You can also look at board operations, policies, and procedural bylaws. We can also check out succession planning. And then finally, what are some things that you can do actually with regard to the elections? We're going to do a quick walkthrough of each of these areas so you can think about any loose ends that you have to tie up before an election. So if you're interested, I also have available some resource material related to this webinar, and you can contact me for those after we've gone through all of this. Although you might also want to take some notes, as the resources might not be as in-depth as you are looking for. So why not start with your strategic plan to see how happy you are with the outcomes so far? Have all the things that you set out to do in your term or just within the last year, have they been accomplished? And if they were accomplished, how satisfied are you with the outcome? Is there still something small to work on or go back to and change? Are there some new things coming out of those priorities that you'll want to tackle in the coming year? So maybe make note of those for something to continue on, something that you might want to mention to the new board or you yourself take up in the next term. And if you aren't actually done yet with those priorities, can you put an initiative on the short track and speed it along? Maybe putting together an ad hoc committee with a specific task list, and be sure to communicate well all the outcomes that you're looking for, specifically step by step what you're looking for from that committee. So you can also reassess an initiative. Maybe you feel that it's no longer relevant and that's why it wasn't completed, or it was a secondary level, and now that you've had time for sober second thought, you realize that it doesn't really need to be completed. But the point is to have a clean slate so that the next incoming board doesn't have to play catch-up. They'll have their own plans and priorities and new things that should be tackled next. So here, by board operations, I'm talking about taking a critical look at processes and procedures. How well is the actual machinery of the board working? You might want to take a critical look at this if you have new trustees come onto your board if they came onto the board at the last election. With every new trustee, the dynamics of the board change, and you may need to assess if the original processes are still working. In the next couple of slides, I'll go a little bit further into the policy and procedure as the way to for some quick fixes. But first you have to identify what, if anything, there is to fix. Perhaps you take a look at your committee structure. This past year I've heard of all different types of structures that divisions are trying, and some are working and maybe some not so much. So at this point you might want to reassess how well the current structure is serving your board. For special issues, try looking for volunteers for just perhaps an ad hoc committee. If you tend to get bogged down in debate, they might help solidify the question. They can bring forward pros and cons that move things forward quicker, and then really bring it forward for a vote. Or you can look at relationships on the board and those with your senior administration. They really should be open and easy. It's not necessary to become, best friends and have every meeting finish with a group hug, but working toward a good professional relationship where the focus remains the work, that really allows you time to fulfill your mandate and make the work enjoyable. It becomes also more appealing for outsiders that might want to get involved. There's also evaluations for both your board, so self-evaluation of your board, and for senior administration. That can help pinpoint areas for improvement, so plan time for this and make sure that it gets done on an annual basis, but then also allow time to address the areas that are causing problems. Another part of board operations to assess is who is responsible for what between the board and senior administration. Look at whether all tasks and decisions are assigned properly. With changes in staff, there could be changes that you haven't noted specifically, so you might want to include that. Also assessing your communication channels. There are obvious ones between trustees and senior administration, but what about with your public or with media? Community engagement is an essential part of doing board business, so consider what and how you might be reporting to them, how it went in the past term. So if you want to look at board operations further, there is actually a division dispatch on our YouTube channel, and it has a quiz on a high-functioning board. It covers many of the areas that will contribute to a smooth operating board, and if you're not familiar with division dispatches, these are training videos that can be accessed through the Manitoba School Boards Association website. This particular one, it has a quiz on a high-functioning board, and that's the opener. And then there are 4 more mini division dispatches that talk about areas, certain areas at a more in-depth level. Once you've taken a critical look at your board's operation, you may see areas that can be addressed through policies and procedures in your governance manual. Your policies will be reviewed from time to time, but anyway, if you look at them from the point of view of board operations, there can be some valuable fixes there. So let's just consider a few. Meeting procedure is one. Is there an area where your board's work is being tripped up? And if so, is there some procedure that can address that? For example, rehashing the same issue or bringing it before the board 4 and 5 times can use up valuable meeting time. So perhaps look at policies around the time allowed for debates. How many times someone maybe speaks to a motion, or the use of a dilatory motion where an item can only be brought before the board a limited number of times in a certain period. If you're bogged down by a decision, you could also try a new way of looking at a question. But the point is really you want to move forward. You might try for a tough question or something that is going to take a lot of debate, or an actual decision-making process. And that can be just looking at a question in different ways, saying now we're going to look at it with only financial considerations. Now we're going to look at it from the point of view of what the public would think if we decided one way or another. So picking apart a debate and focusing the questions in that manner can help you bring a decision point. You should be able to come, though, to a timely conclusion and move on to the next piece of business. That's really what a decision-making process is all about. Actual meeting processes can be used to tighten things up, or tighten up a meeting format and make it more formal. Or if it's too tight, look at whether it's creating a lack of debate and a feeling of not being heard. Or is there too much being discussed in camera so that when it comes to a public meeting of the board, there's no open debate and it just looks like your board is rubber stamping decisions? Several boards have chosen to include right in their governance manual a list or a table of who is responsible for what decision. For example, it might be the board's responsibility to set the strategic plan or priorities for the next 3 or 4 years, but then it's the senior administration's responsibility to prepare the operational or work plan according to that strategic plan. So some boards choose to write that directly into their policy manual. If you've covered all bases and have time, also take a look at the policies and procedures that haven't been reviewed in a long time. Again, some boards have an actual schedule of when a certain policy should be reviewed. So not every policy has to be reviewed on the same schedule. For example, if you have a policy on, say, sustainable development or communications, you might want to schedule it for review every 1, 2, or 3 years. But one on values or succession planning may only need to be reviewed every 5 years. So having an actual schedule for a review creates a process where not everything comes forward at once, and it's just part of a normal course of business. Everything does get reviewed. So sometimes it's really only a small tweak, but it can make for a much happier board. Okay, something just for fun now. Let's take a look at this. Assembling the Supreme Leadership Board, and I am ready to name the heir to succeed me. We don't have a Supreme Leadership Board, and this isn't a hereditary dictatorship. And that's crazy talk. Okay, who is it, or who was it that said dictatorship is the most efficient form of leadership? I don't know if that's really the way you want to go. So let's consider some other things instead, and that's around succession planning. Succession planning is really another way to say planning for the future, or even making sure that you are insured. Obviously, trustees don't necessarily want to tip their hand always to say whether they want to run again. But this is really about getting your house in order when it comes to elections and new people coming on your board. Have you created a house that is appealing to the community? It needs to be one that is focused and providing good stewardship for the division, and it's not about winning your own seat or working to have someone that on the board that will have your back. It's about creating a robust competition for the next election with issues that pique interest of possible candidates. It's about creating a board that will be of interest to good people. This is one of the best moves for good succession planning on your board. It can also be about taking an assessment of who's on your board and what skills they bring to the board. And if they don't run, what characteristics would you need to replace them? Characteristics suitable for good policy development, governance, financial literacy, good at communication skills, public relations, good listeners, good team players. You might consider holding a forum or putting out some information on what trustees do. The Manitoba School Boards Association has information on its website that could be of interest to people considering running. So at the very least, you could direct people to these resources. Or considering having your administration put some election information directly on the divisional website. But of course, the board should have some oversight on exactly what is put on there in the format. You'll have an orientation for the new trustee. Is the plan still the same as the last time? Take note of whether there are some improvements that can be made since your last orientation. So another question you could even use to put before your board is just by saying now, does your board as a whole promote trustee elections? You might want to consider that and what you'd actually do for that. If you're interested in another webinar, there's one with 10 tips to encourage people to get out and vote. It's really about ongoing community engagement. Engagement is a long and continuous process. Having someone show up at the polling station without thought of the issues or even who the candidates are and what they stand for is perhaps not the best approach. If you'd like the 10 quick tips on getting voters out, I can also provide it as a resource once you've viewed the webinar. There are a lot of things that your board can do to encourage people to cast their vote. Have a discussion at your board table on what your whole board can do to promote the elections and get involved. So there it is. Have you got your house in order? Are there a few things that you can clean up before the next board comes in? I hope that all is well in hand and the amount of work isn't daunting between now and the next, say, election. Although maybe it will convince you to stay on as a trustee if you don't feel that all the work is done. Thanks for joining me.